Today's speakers are none other than Lucane LaFortune and Alicia Sanchez-Gill. So I'm going to introduce our lovely speakers for today, and then you all have the floor. Lucane LaFortune is a Haitian American intersectional womanist and fat activist who enjoys podcasts and playing chess. She's a full-time mom to a spunky daughter. LaFortune is currently the director of the National Human Trafficking Training and Technical Assistance Center. Prior to that, she was the deputy director of the Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence, where she worked closely with the executive director and managed the organization's activities. Lucane also pioneered the opening of the largest domestic violence housing program in Washington, D.C. Through her visionary leadership and meticulous management, she ensured in the provision of critical services to families in need, while also implementing trauma-informed programs. She is pursuing a PhD in education and organizational leadership. As a victim service expert, her work is informed by her lived experience as a survivor of sexual violence, anti-fatness, and anti-Blackness. She's also fluent in French and Haitian Creole, and with conversational Spanish skills. Ms. LaFortune embraces inclusivity and fosters meaningful connections with diverse communities. So thank you for joining us today. Now, Alicia Sanchez-Gill is a queer Afro-Latinx survivor and advocate with nearly 20 years of experience in intersectional, anti-violence, and harm reduction work with organizations and collectives that center survivors who have been left out of mainstream anti-violence movements. She's currently the executive director of Emergent Fund, a rapid response fund rooted in movement building. In her role, Alicia has raised and moved millions of dollars to Black, Indigenous, and people of color-led grassroots organizations, mobilizing in response to COVID-19, family separation, Muslim bans, police brutality, abortion bans, climate injustice, LGBTQ+ rights, gender justice, and more. Prior to Emergent Fund, Alicia was the interim ED of a grassroots trans and queer survivor-led organizing collective, working on local and national campaigns to end interpersonal and state patriarchal violence with abolition from the carceral state as a North Star. Her writing has been published and referenced in national media, academic journals, and a variety of digital outlets. Alicia holds a master's of social work, but other survivors have been her best teachers. I love that. So I'm gonna go ahead and share your presentation. So we can get started. All right.
Hello, thank you, Rava. Thank you so much. Thank y'all so much for being here with us. I'm Alicia Sanchez-Gill, pronouns she, ella. I'm coming to y'all from the unceded territory of the Piscataway people, otherwise known as Chocolate City, and to some, Washington, D.C. And Lucane and I are so thrilled to be with familiar faces and new friends.
Good morning, everybody. Are you still there, Alicia?
Whether that's on the phone or via the chat. Lucane, I see folks saying that you might be frozen right now. So what I'm gonna do, Lucane, if maybe you just mute yourself. Oh, there you are. I think you're back. If you need to
Oh, that's so funny. I thought you all were frozen.
Nope, I think it's you. I don't know. Y'all can tell us in the chat actually if who is frozen and what y'all are seeing, so we can help to do some technical troubleshooting. Anyway, happy to be here with y'all. Thank y'all so much to the team at Ujima for gathering us together and for like creating space to have some of these conversations. And then for the folks who will be managing our slides, we thank you. Is it okay if I just say like next slide for folks to go on to the next one? Is that cool? Thank you. So I'll ask you to go to the next slide. One other note I'll just say is that we would love questions. So like as things are coming up, go ahead and put them into the chat box. And we'll kind of keep a tally, and we may do some intermittent answering of questions, and then we will definitely save some Q&A time for the end. So you know who is in the room with you. It's Alicia and Lucane. Happy to be here. Let me go to the next slide, and I'll just talk y'all through the agenda. Amazing. So we'll do some introduction. We've gotten a good idea of who is in the room through the meeting chat. So we're seeing some direct service providers, some TA providers, and kind of a varied range of folks who are interacting with survivors in different ways. Some folks who are organizing with other survivors. So we'll do we've done some intros. We'll go over some definitions just to ground us in this conversation, and then we'll do some historical foundations and timeline mapping. Lucane and I will be leading that, but we also invite you to like contribute to this collective timeline that we're creating. And then we'll talk about intersectionality and some other tools to fight back against anti-fat bias and erosion of bodily autonomy in the United States. So thank you all again for being a part of this conversation with us. Yeah, we're gonna like really explore the concepts of bodily autonomy, the concepts of surveillance, and how that impacts marginalized communities. So let's go to the next slide, and we'll just start with some definitions. Bodily autonomy or body autonomy really refers to the rights and abilities of individuals to have control over our own bodies. That includes making decisions about our health, about our reproductive choices, and about personal boundaries. So that's kind of what's grounding this conversation. When we talk about surveillance, which is kind of another big theme that you'll hear us touch on quite a lot in this conversation, when we talk about surveillance, we include the monitoring and tracking of individuals, often and especially by government or corporate entities, which can infringe upon our personal privacy and contribute to power imbalances and discrimination. So a lot of this conversation will be focused on state surveillance. And then marginalized communities, groups of folks who experience social, economic, and political disadvantages and are subject to systemic discrimination with limited access to resources. And that can be based on race, size, class, and other kind of identities. Let's move on to some more. We got a lot of definitions here that we're going to be working with. So you'll hear us talk a lot about these, and then happy to like share. We've got some citations, we've got some notes for y'all to take home, and also hope that this will be a collaborative conversation. So if there's parts of definitions that you feel like, oh, like I would have added something else to this, throw it in the chat box. We really want to see, because it helps us to like develop our own rigor. So defining body autonomy and control, that encompasses the ability to make decisions. We've talked about that one, but informed consent we haven't talked about. So this is something that's probably really familiar to many of us, particularly working in organizations that are interrupting and trying to abolish patriarchal violence. But informed consent is a crucial aspect of body autonomy, ensuring that individuals have the necessary information to make autonomous decisions about our bodies and our medical interventions. And then individual rights. Respecting bodily autonomy supports the recognition of individual rights, such as the right to privacy, bodily integrity, and also self-determination. Now that we've talked about some of these definitions, I just want to say too that like, we'll be going through some of this in more detail. So, if it feels like I'm moving quickly, please ask me to slow down. And also, we will be sharing some of this afterwards. Will we receive a copy of the PowerPoint? I'm sure we can make that happen. Yeah. I'm sure we can work with Ujima to get this to y'all as well. So I'm going to pass it to my colleague, brilliant colleague Lucane, to talk about the historical foundations of bodily surveillance. Lucane, if you're having any issues with tech, I can also, yeah, you're welcome, Felicia. I can also keep going. Lucane, you ready to jump in?
Yes, I am.
Awesome.
Can you all hear me?
I can hear you great.
Yes.
Okay, great. So I
Yeah.
turned off my camera just in case that will help with me getting being frozen. And so, just to add to what Alicia has already said, today when we talk about marginalized communities, we're primarily focusing on Black women, which includes trans women and also non-conforming folks, because that's basically our lived experience, and so that's what the focus is on. And it may feel like we're being a little bit more academic, but just to set the stage, we are zooming out to look at systems and then also zooming in to look at the impacts on the individuals and also the root causes. And so, in terms of body surveillance and its historical roots, why is it important to talk about that? Well, body surveillance is basically monitoring and scrutinizing individuals' bodies, which is prevalent in so many ways, various societal mechanisms and institutions. And so, today, by delving into the historical foundations of body surveillance, we want to be able to gain some insights into the current impact and implications. Additionally, we recognizing the importance of body surveillance helps us comprehend the role that it plays in shaping social norms, power dynamics, and individual experiences. And so, I usually like to throw in my own personal experiences in there, but I'd like to do that by starting out with the way that I see it is as a young woman. Even though I've lived in various countries from birth, my body, who I am, I have been surveilled and I have been monitored from, my weight to what I wear, as far as like, I've been told that, this is what girls wear, this is what girls don't wear, this is how we act in public. And as I continue to go to school, my body continue to be monitored. And there are certain things that I've been told by not just family but society in general in terms of ways to exist, so that I don't get caught up in institutions and various other things. For me, one experience is police violence and also sexual violence, um, and how those things intersect, particularly not just for me but also other Black bodies. And so I just wanted to connect the dots, and so that you can bring in your own perspectives and your own experiences as well as we continue to move through these slides. Next slide, please. And so I kind of went through this and talked about why it's important today. And so let's go to the next slides. I want to start out with the historical foundation. Um, while we're starting with colonialism, I want to make sure that we honor the fact that this particular land that we on didn't necessarily start with colonialism. Long before that, indigenous populations were subjected to body surveillance and policing and also violence as well. And so moving forward, if as you can see, we'll explore colonialism, which, as you know, colonial powers employed body surveillance and exerted control over uh, African American folks, especially during this enslavement era. And I want to point out Venus Hottentot, which many of you may be familiar with. She was before the Jim Crow era, but she's an example of someone who was highly surveilled. Um, her name was Sarky Bartman. She was known as Hottentot Venus. And like I said, it predates Jim Crow era, but it's a prominent example of how the objectification and surveillance of Black women's bodies. She was a Khoi woman from South Africa who was paraded around Europe as a freak show and attraction, because of her body size and her large buttocks. And she became an emblem to European racial stereotyping and exoticism. And so that's one example that I wanted to point out, or we wanted to point out historically that's happened. Um, and then we go on to the body mass or BMI introduction, which happened in the early 1900s and the 21st century, continued on. And you all are familiar with the body mass index or BMI, which even though it has been, it it doesn't really have any kind of research foundations. It continued to be used to surveil and to police bodies, right? And so it goes all the way to the 21st century and became a standard of measure for accessing for individuals in general, but for policing and surveilling our bodies, letting us know whether we were healthy or not healthy, even though there's no way of using the BMI to show that. And when they did the studies, no one like us, no one who looked like us participated in the studies. So next slide, what we're gonna do is take a deeper look at BMI, and it comes from a video by Dr. Strings. She explains how fat phobia is rooted in centuries of racism and how BMI can be very problematic. So we'll take a look at that video.
Um, would either you or Alicia be able to send me the video in a separate link? It looks like it's not
Oh,
playing the
oh, you're
presentation.
not able to click on there?
No.
Okay. Um, just a minute.
Okay, no
Let's
problem.
see. So I'll continue to talk about that.
Okay, and I'll send it over. Just a
Yeah, and you
second.
could send over. Yeah, that's good. And so we continue on while Ujima is looking at the for the link. But then we go into eugenics. Many of you are familiar with this movement, which was between the 18 to 1900, which advocated for selective breeding. And a lot of you may or may not be familiar with someone who's very famous, um, which is Margaret Sanger, feminists who are suffragists, I should say, who definitely believe in eugenics. And this movement not only sought to control bodies that were deemed unfit, but also promoted the idea that certain races, uh, especially races that were not white, um, were not deemed to continue to exist, and also included disability, people with disabilities and other traits, and deemed them as inferior. And so eugenics, much like during the Nazi Germany, the Nazi era, believed that they needed to cleanse the human race by not allowing folks who were unfit or of other races to exist. And then we continue on to the slavery era. And one of the examples that often comes up for me is the mammy stereotype. And I often see myself in that because I have experienced people calling me mama out of nowhere in the workplace. I'm like, I'm not your mama, okay? And so in that time, at that time, the mammy stereotype was very busy serving as a surrogate mother, a grandmother to white families. She was very loyal to her white family, and she was often looked at, somebody who could risk her life to defend them. And we saw in The Birth of a Nation, which is a very old film from 1915. Um, Also, it's based on which was based on Thomas Dixon's racist novel. I'm not sure if you are familiar with it, but The Klansman. She defended her master's home against black and white Union soldiers. And so the message was clear that she would rather fight for white folks than to be free. And there's also the famous film Gone with the Wind. There is the black mammy who also fights black soldiers during that time. Okay, I just wanted to check back in to see if you were able to get that video. If not, I'll continue to plow through.
No, I haven't received it. I could look it up on YouTube if that makes things easier.
Yeah, that could help too. If not, we
I
can
did
add
send
it.
it to Araba. I sent it via direct message, but maybe you didn't see it. So
Did not.
Yeah, that's fine. If not,
I
we
sent
can
it to you
always
just
send
now
it
in the
this
chat.
way. All right, great, great.
Is it?
That's exactly right.
Okay.
Yep. Thank you.
I decided I would try to trace the transition in the Western world from valuing voluptuous figures to valuing slender ones. And what I found was that it had everything to do with the growth of the slave trade. In the early years of slavery, voluptuous physiques were prized because slavery and the Renaissance were coterminous. And by a couple of centuries on, in the middle of the 18th century, it was very common for race scientists to suggest that, race is not just about skin color, it's also about behavior and appearance. We know that Europeans are the most superior, most disciplined, most rational of all the races. And that's why they are at the top of our racial hierarchies. But we also think that Black people are overly sensuous. They love sex, they love food. And as a result, they are chock full of venereal diseases and they are overweight. So from this, we have the seedlings of our current aesthetic system, which suggests that white, slender bodies, especially women's bodies, are valuable. But fat bodies, and especially fat Black bodies, are worth denigration. It's not just about health. This is clearly about aesthetics. This is about disciplining women often, and it's also about population management. People often feel uncomfortable with fat bodies. And so they do not want people themselves to feel comfortable gaining weight or being fat, especially when those people are women. And that goes back to the legacy of slavery and the ways in which the male gaze is often trying to regulate women's bodies, such that they only have the right to look in particular ways. Wasn't until the 1980s around that the medical field started to use BMI. BMI, they admitted, was both flawed and arbitrary, but they adopted it anyway. And we can see the wreckage that has resulted from that decision. That is to say, seemingly, there could have been almost no racial diversity in the studies that were used to create BMI, and we would today call this a form of colorblind racism. Of course, back in the era of slavery, we expected, or at least Westerners at that time expected, that Europeans were the ones creating what constituted good and bad science. But these days, we live in a world of multiculturalism and inclusion, and we understand that white men in lab coats should not alone determine standards for the globe without research that is incorporating a diverse array of individuals. So you talk to doctors there, and they say things like, we are interested in the holistic portrait of our patients. That means when they come in, they can take their weight, but their weight is not going to be the main thing they're going to talk to them about. They're going to talk to them about their family history, their dietary practices, their exercise, their sleep, their levels of stress. All of these things and many more contribute to our health outcomes. We can talk about environmental toxins. We can talk about the walkability of your neighborhood. Do you have access to grocery stores or only convenience stores? All of these things are consequential to our health outcomes. But unfortunately, they're not taken that seriously within the medical establishment in this country.
Thank you so much for sharing.
All right, thank you. And so, we go into medical racism and stereotyping. Um, more examples of that are during the time when J. Marion Sims, a famous gynecologist who is considered the father of gynecology, we learned that was conducting experiments on in surgeries on enslaved women without any kind of anesthesia. And this was during the early 1800s. And in fact, a lot of people came out and tried to defend him and said, it was because of the time, that it's not, he didn't really mean to do that. It was that he was I guess, someone of his time. Um, and so we look at, Black women's bodies, were often pathologized and continue to be pathologized by the medical community. Our bodies and shapes, especially if they deviated from white norms, as Dr. Strings mentioned, were sometimes framed as unhealthy and aberrant. This medical gaze was not only biased, but also resulted in inadequate medical care. And go all the way back to Henrietta Lacks. We're not good enough, but for whatever reasons, we were good enough in that situation, for her genes to be stolen, and they finally recognized that, later on in the 20th century. We also see maternal health, particularly for Black women, is sometimes ends in dire consequences, not only because of the lack of health care that they may experience, but also they're not listened to when they go to the hospital, um, when they go get and seek medical care. We also look back and see that Black women historically were also used, not only surveilled, but also used as machines to breastfeed white children. And so I just want to take a pause to see where we are, if people have questions, or comments, anything coming up in the chat. And also, I want to make sure that you're able to hear me, um, because I'm getting kind of a like a slow lag on my end. I'm not sure if you're able to hear me well.
I can
It's
hear you
going
great, Lucane. Yeah, I can hear
okay.
you great. Yeah. Other folks, though, please
Yeah,
join in the
please.
chat and let Lucane know. Affirm her if you can hear.
Yes, yes. Let me know. And so we'll continue to move forward if there are no other questions or there are no questions. But then we go to leasing during the Jim Crow era. One of the things that, or after the Jim Crow era, a lot of people don't realize that leasing really impacted women. And this picture, hopefully, um, that next slide, please. This picture is from a really famous writer who talks about convict leasing and its impact on Black women. Oftentimes, when we see that, we see Black men, and yes, convict leasing systemically impacted Black men, but they also impacted Black women. They were not exempt, and it impacted them in so many different ways, from direct exploitation. Some Black women were directly caught up in the system. They could be arrested for minor or trumped up charges, such as vagrancy, and then leased out to work in the fields, factories, or as domestic workers. Harsh conditions, that they had to work under harsh conditions, just like the men had to work in harsh conditions. They also faced physical and sexual abuse, grueling work hours, inadequate food and shelter, and also limited medical care. Their treatment was in so many ways similar to the same conditions when they were enslaved. And of course, there was a lot of family separation, um, and sexual exploitation, as we mentioned before. Because a lot of Black men were disproportionately imprisoned during the convict leasing era. There were a lot of risk. A lot of women were at risk and also sexually exploited, and became more vulnerable to sexual violence and coercion by white employers, landlords, and other people in positions of power. And the economic dependency definitely impacted Black women as well. But there was a lot of resistance and activism. It's not, we want to make sure, hopefully, when we get to that part, we want to make sure that we uplift that there was resistance and activism, right? The injustices of the convict leasing system and its impact on the Black community definitely galvanized a lot of Black women to become activists. They played an essential role in advocacy, resistance, and efforts to dismantle the system. Groups like the National Association of Colored Women, or NACW, were definitely at the forefront of various social reform movements, including fighting against convict leasing. Next slide, please. And then many of you probably remember the Tuskegee, or know of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. And oftentimes, once again, people think about the men who were the direct victims of this study. But for those of you who don't know, the Tuskegee study basically infected many Black men with syphilis, and it was a between 1932 to 1972. 40 years that they did this and did not provide any kind of treatment. And so you can imagine, right, what happens to those men who did not know they had syphilis and they were not treated, but they were part of this study and they were unaware of that. And they went back home, and definitely impacted their community, whether it was LGBTQ community, or it was their heterosexual partners. So and people often wonder why there is a lack of trust within the community, even though we've been surveilled, we've been um, really pretty much almost been on the brink of genocide, if you think about it, because of the practices, the medical practices that happen on women and men and folks and non-gender conforming folks. And then we go back to, we start getting to the next slide, please. The war on drugs. We think about how those policies really affected women and how women were seen as more problematic when it came to drug use. With crack cocaine epidemic, if we compare that to how things, how the response is, people is very different to now, when people look at methamphetamine and how empathetic people are to those folks who are using methamphetamine versus Black women back in the day, um, during the 1990s, who were hooked on crack and cocaine. There's also the Anti-Drug Abuse Act that happened in 1986, which really impacted women and penalized, started penalizing people harshly for possessing just like an ounce of cocaine. And then we go to the Clinton era, where the 1994 Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act was signed, and this really impacted our communities. The three strikes and you're out policy, which in some places still continues to today, had a major impact on Black and Brown bodies in this country. Okay, so we'll turn the timeline to you now, Alicia, to talk about
Yeah.
the stop and frisk and other um, historical events.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lucane. That is so powerful, grounding, infuriating. You've said a few things that I just really want to like put like just double tap on.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I'm thinking a lot about is just you talked a little bit about the varied public health responses to the crack cocaine epidemic
Mm-hmm.
versus methamphetamines as well as opioid addictions. And we
Mm-hmm.
see that really clearly there's like a couple of things happening. I think one of the things that happened, right, is because of some of that really harmful pseudoscientific work by doctors and scientists like J. Marion Sims, right? There's
Mm-hmm.
this belief that Black women in particular don't experience pain, right? That's
Right.
why they're able to experiment on our bodies without informed consent, without anesthesia, right? Because there was this belief that Black folks, particularly Black women, didn't experience pain the same way that white folks do.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result of that, we were then prescribed fewer opioids, right? We're prescribed less pain medication. Like, you know, the data says that we are less likely to be trusted with medication, less likely to be prescribed pain medication. And then as a result, less likely to be the folks who are seeking support for opioid addiction, right? And so there's this way in which even how we both, and then of course, the response to addiction, to opioid addiction has been much more of a public health model versus a criminal justice and criminal legal model, right? But we see these, like, we have to see this as like a timeline of really interconnected values, beliefs, assumptions, stereotypes, and then policies that are reflected in how we're responding to a new crisis. So I'm just really glad that you brought that up. The other thing that I wanted to talk a little bit about was the trend of the increasing incarceration with the three strikes laws. So I know we've moved on to the next slide. So I'll talk a little bit about domestic violence shelters in particular. I might start there because one of the things that I think is always really important to name with my like DV anti-violence comrades is the fact that like when we think about the Violence Against Women Act, we have to recognize that the Violence Against Women Act was also a suite of pieces of legislation that didn't just include protections for domestic violence survivors, but also really set the groundwork for mass criminalization and increased policing, which didn't just impact abusers, right? It impacted survivors too, survivors who are defending themselves from violence. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that, but Lucane, you just really got me thinking so much. So thank you. So the first thing I'll talk a little bit about is stop and frisk policies. So this started happening in the late 20th century through 21st century. We saw Black and brown individuals, especially in the US, and a lot of our language data is focused on the US not because this isn't a global phenomenon, but because this is the kind of space that we're all sharing together in our work right now. But we understand that these things are globally connected. Because of the stop and frisk policies, especially in the US, Black folks, particularly Black and brown individuals, Black and Latinx individuals, have been disproportionately subjected to invasive law enforcement practices. There's one thing that I want to bring up, because I think often when we think about stop and frisk policies, we are particularly concerned with, for good reason, the disproportionate impact on Black men. But I also want to name that there are some other ways that this shows up for Black women and Black gender marginalized people, including Black trans women. One of the ways that we have seen some of this show up is in the criminalization of sex work. And so how that has looked, I can talk kind of extensively about work in DC, but how that has often looked is that sex workers are often marginalized. Back in 2006, there was a tool that the police department was using called prostitution-free zones, where they could basically, if they saw too many Black trans folks gathered, they could designate that space a prostitution-free zone. And in that space, the police were able to order anyone to leave the area or face arrest purely through racial profiling based on appearance, on race, on gender identity. And in that way, the police could, or the arresting officer could use just someone's gender identity and what they were wearing as a solid basis for suspicion during the duration of a prostitution-free zone. The flyers that they would hand out or paste in a prostitution-free zone would say something like, any person congregating in a group of 2 or more in a public space within the boundaries of this prostitution-free zone for the purpose of engaging in prostitution or prostitution-related offenses is subject to arrest. Now, how we decide who's there for the purpose of engaging in sex work is certainly arbitrary, but really grounded in our assumptions about race and gender, and in particular, transphobia against Black trans women, right? So there are these ways in which this is actually a practice of stop and frisk that we don't see because it's both racialized and gendered. So stop and frisk does not just impact Black and brown men, it also impacts women and gender marginalized people. Another thing that I want to bring up in this timeline is the child welfare system. There's quite a bit of data now talking about the fact that Black and brown, particularly Black and Indigenous women, are disproportionately surveilled. And one thing I want to say about stop and frisk as well is like, these are like great examples, right, of the way that we give the state permission, or we don't, but the state gives itself permission, right, to surveil our bodies, our clothing, our gender identity, our race, right? The other way that we see that show up is in child welfare. So we know that Black women who are giving birth are like 10 times more likely to be tested for drugs in the hospital than white women. And we know that we are more likely to be referred to child welfare if we bring our child in for an injury. I have a 2.5-year-old, and so if you know anything about 2.5-year-olds, you know that they fall a lot, they jump off of things, they're like constantly, like it's like they're trying to hurt themselves. And my job is to protect them from doing that. But also, I have deep fear about what happens if I bring my child to the hospital, right? Because I know that I'm much more likely to be referred to child welfare for investigation because of the fact that my child has literally jumped off the couch, right? And so we see the ways that like the medical systems, social workers, all of these systems are often complicit in surveilling Black women and Black gender marginalized people. I would not be myself if I didn't bring up the way that domestic violence shelter programs surveil Black women, Black survivors, whether that's curfews, surveilling what we eat, monitoring whether or not we've talked to our abusers. There are all of these ways too that our own programs can act as surveillance agents of the state that we won't talk a lot about this today, but I really encourage you to think about like what are some of the ways that you are actually enacting the surveillance, doing the job of the state to surveil Black women and survivors in your own programs. And then I'll just say that mass incarceration has had a disproportionate impact on communities of color, particularly Black and Latino communities. It's been linked to such a range of societal issues, from our own, like kind of our own internal forms of family separation to economic disadvantages, inability to build generational wealth, and of course, violence in heavily policed neighborhoods. And then I'll share too a little bit about school pushout, which folks may be familiar with. Highly recommend looking at the National Women's Law Center if this is like a term or concept that you are not familiar with, and I can drop a link in the chat as well. So school pushout for girls of color, what we often see is that in terms of surveillance, the discipline policies that push, we talk a lot about the school to prison pipeline, right? But what we also know is that girls of color, particularly Black girls, are also disproportionately experiencing their own form of school pushout and school to prison pipeline. And how we see that showing up is that many disciplinarian policies that we see Black girls being punished for are informed by racial biases and stereotypes. So we are stereotyped as being sassy, loud, aggressive, confrontational. Ironically, of course, speaking your mind or being assertive is seen as a positive leadership quality when it's displayed by white girls and women. But these behaviors are often not just discouraged, but punishable for Black girls. And so Black girls are experiencing this daily at school by teachers, administrations, other students, school resource officers, or police in school. There's such a big movement by young folks around getting police outside of school systems. And so, yes, Dr. Monique Morris has done so much work on school pushout. So thank you for lifting. I'll make sure I text her and tell her we lift her up in this space. So thank you, Kenyora. So discrimination that folks are experiencing at school often leads to increased surveillance and increased punishment for Black and brown girls, but in particular Black girls. This also shows up as like very gendered profiling. And so what that might look like is that certain hairstyles are seen as more disruptive on Black girls. Certain clothes are seen as more disruptive because of, assumptions or stereotypes about Black women and girls' body types, right? So certain clothes that white girls might be able to get away with, Black girls cannot. We recognize that this is like an issue of gender, like overall, but there are some specific and explicit and disproportionate ways that Black girls are impacted by surveillance around how they talk, what they wear, how they show their leadership skills. And then I talked a little bit about the criminalization of sex work and abortion, but what I'll also share is that, I want to share an example, which is that we learned that there were some law enforcement agencies that had been going into Facebook groups that were specifically for folks who were seeking, options around reproductive justice, including abortion. There were law enforcement agencies that were going undercover and finding out joining Facebook groups to find out, where folks were getting abortions so that they could, criminalize them, right? And so there's a way in which with the advent of social media, folks are trying, particularly abortion providers are being really careful about how we how to counsel folks around using their options, but also being really careful about using social media to talk about getting services. There are ways in which in places where abortion is criminalized, folks can actually, law enforcement agencies can go in and see your search history to see if you've looked up how to access an abortion, right? So there are these ways in which, and maybe the last thing that I'll add specifically to this point is there's this overlap between like anti-trans bias and abortion access, in the sense that we've seen some schools who are trying to check on young folks' periods, right? So they're like asking young folks who are in girls and women's sports, they're asking them to track their periods. And it's a really interesting and unsurprising like relationship between both it's anti-trans bias, because the reason that they're checking periods is to ensure that people are biologically female, right? But then the other thing that they're doing is also being able to monitor whether or not people are having abortions by testing people's periods. Now we know that young folks, the way that our periods work, especially in youth, they can, even into different ages, right, can be really inconsistent. But these are some ways that the state then emboldens school systems to monitor and surveil and then criminalize young folks, particularly Black women. Next slide, please. That was a mouthful. So let's explore the relationship between weight stigma and body surveillance. So weight stigma refers to the negative attitudes, beliefs, and stereotypes towards individuals based on their body weight. This form of weight stigma really has historical roots to what Lucane shared earlier, in societal beauty ideas and in cultural norms that have evolved over time. We know that weight stigma really reinforces body surveillance by imposing judgment, discrimination, and social pressure on individuals to conform to societal standards of body weight. By recognizing the role of weight stigma and body surveillance, it's really an essential part of understanding the impact that it has on individuals' physical and mental well-being. Next slide. So you can see the photo here of Jodie Comer, who was listed as the most, they tried to be really scientific about this, right? It's like about symmetry and all of these things, but it's actually like not a mistake that this is a person who falls into kind of what we see as like standard westernized beauty ideals. Cultural influences such as the media, beauty standards, and ideal body types significantly contribute to body surveillance. Media in particular plays a pivotal role in shaping societal beauty standards and promoting specific types of bodies as desirable, as valuable, as worth saving, as worthy of dignity, right? As worthy of respect. Beauty standards, which have, of course, varied across cultures and time periods, also have a profound impact on bodily ideals and perpetuate body surveillance. The portrayal of ideal body types in the media and like the lifting up of specific body types in the media and popular culture really further normalizes and reinforces the surveillance of other bodies, particularly bodies who deviate from what is seen as the standard or the ideal of beauty. It's really important to understand these kinds of cultural influences to examine the broader context of body surveillance. Next slide, please. So the medicalization of body and health paradigms, diagnostic criteria, implications, and those implications for body surveillance. I'll just talk a little bit about some of these definitions here. So when we're talking about a health paradigm, what we mean is the medicalization of the body, which involves viewing various aspects of human functioning through a health-focused lens. I'll come back to that one. Diagnostic criteria includes the classifications that contribute to the medicalization of body and enable surveillance within healthcare system. And then implications for body surveillance. The medicalization of body perpetuates body surveillance by pathologizing and monitoring various aspects of individuals' bodies and behaviors. Lucane touched on this beautifully before, but I just want to lift up again the way that BMI shows up in this way, right? So I might go into the Lucane and I talk about this a lot. So Lucane, if I'm like share too much, you just let me know. But I'm going into the doctor because I sprained my ankle and they're asking me about my BMI, right? Like the way that bodies and larger bodies are constantly being surveilled related to BMI is like a constant form of insidious violence that fat folks experience. It's a way that medical systems police us. It means that I have a harder time accessing uh, 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 life insurance, right? It means I have a harder time accessing medical insurance. All of this surveillance is related to my body size and type. And what it also means then, to Lucane's earlier point, is that it's not that fat folks are less healthy necessarily or at all, but it's often that we are receiving substandard care, right? And we have very real, because of medical bias, stigma, and outright violence against fat folks, right? There are real fears and concerns about interacting with medical systems. So we are less likely to go to the primary care physician because we know that we will experience shaming, stigma when we get there, right? And so all of these ways, and surveillance when we get there, right? So all of these things are related to the way that fat folks are experiencing medical systems and the way that medical systems see us as a problem, as something to be fixed, and as something to pathologize, as humans to pathologize. Next slide. Thank you. I want to talk a little bit about the relationship between gender and body surveillance. So societal gender roles and expectations play such a significant role in shaping body surveillance. These roles and expectations really impose specific ideals and standards on different genders and different gender presentations. Societal norms regarding body appearance, behavior, and conformity contribute to the surveillance of marginalized gendered bodies. The impact of gender on body surveillance perpetuates inequality and really reinforces rigid notions of masculinity and femininity. Understanding the connection between gender and body surveillance is also vital in recognizing the norms that contribute to surveillance of bodies. So I have a couple of examples that I want to talk a little bit about. If you see the picture that I've posted here, this is Caster Semenya, who is a runner from South Africa, who, when she started just like knocking it out of the park with her running, what we saw is an uptick of particularly white newscasters, white sports commentators, really trying to figure out her gender, so much so that they put her under like incredible scrutiny, including testing her, not just her physical external body, but also her genetic body, to check to make sure she was a real woman, a cisgender woman. And so we know that there's a way in which specifically Black women are incredibly policed and surveilled about womanhood and about femininity. What we know is that like Black women from the time of enslavement have not often had access to the concept of femininity. And we can see that with the way that anti-trans bias not only impacts disproportionately Black trans women, but also impacts Black cisgender women like Michelle Obama or Serena Williams, who have constantly been under media scrutiny and been misgendered, labeled as trans when they're not trans, and also leading to actual anti-trans violence against Black trans women. The National Black Women Justice Institute conducted a survey that was open to US-based Black women, trans folks, non-binary, and gender non-conforming folks. And what they found was that they were often 55% of us had been pulled over by police at least 4 times in our lives. Uh, we had experienced, among our experiences with policing, we'd also experienced harm from the encounter, whether that was physical harm, sexual violence, and or psychological harm like threats, intimidation, or using slurs. We know that sexual violence after excessive use of force is the most, sexual violence is the most common form of police violence, and we know that it disproportionately impacts Black women and Black gender marginalized people. And so what those folks who were in the survey said was that they thought that this consequence was a direct result of stop and frisk or racial profiling. And so we know that racial profiling and gender profiling often like live simultaneously. I'll turn it back to Lucane to talk a little bit more about body surveillance.
Yeah, thank you, Alicia. I wanted to add just a little bit about, in terms of what you mentioned with Michelle Obama. I was just thinking back to when I saw uh, something on MSN.com that mentioned, yeah, it was an article that talked about, that basically focused on the fact that Michelle Obama is often mistaken for a trans woman. And I was shocked to see that on the front page of MSN.com, because I was like, oh, who is making that comparison, or mistaking her for that? So I just thought that I would share that with you all, because I think it's really fascinating, because she's so well known. Um, Yet, these are the stories that are being told about her. And so, next slide, please. And what I'm gonna do with the this next slide is basically continue to connect the dots. Um, the intersection of race and body surveillance is really important, because racial identity plays a crucial role in shaping body surveillance. As individuals from various racial backgrounds, we often face unique pressures and stereotypes. Racial stereotypes absolutely significantly influence body surveillance, because they impose ideals and expectations on individuals based on their racial background. And the intersection of race and body surveillance deepens the impact of surveillance on marginalized communities, because it reinforces systemic inequalities and creates complex dynamics. So, recognizing the role of race in body surveillance is essential in dismantling systems, especially the systems of oppression. And also, it is important, and when we are working towards equitable representation in any uh, area that we're working in. And so, for many of you all who probably came here who from gendered violence, the gendered violence movement, or gender-based violence movement, anti-violence movement, whatever you might call it, I think it's important for us to consistently zoom out and take a look at how bodies are surveilled, and which bodies are surveilled, and how bodies are policed, and which bodies are policed, and how that impacts and intersects with the systemic inequalities. And what does that look like for you when it comes to service provision? Right? As Alicia mentioned earlier, how are you continuing the surveillance? How do you continue to act as an agent of the system itself? And so we have like one interesting example. Next slide, please, that Alicia and I like to refer to, which is really interesting to us when we talk about how the state violence is connected to like body surveillance. I'm not sure if any of you know this, but the treadmill was invented as a form of torture for prisoners, for incarcerated folks. In the early 19th century, treadmills were introduced as a form of punishment in prisons, and prisoners were actually asked to walk these treadmills for extended periods of time, and often with no real purpose other than exertion. And so this served as a way of controlling and disciplining the incarcerated folks, and creating a sense of surveillance over their bodies, right? And now we think about what treadmills are used for. So it's another example worth considering is the perpetuation of weight stigma, as Alicia talked about earlier, um, by movements like the white women's suffrage movement. We talked about both Alicia and I were saying how frustrated we were that we could not use the word, the famous "Ain't I a Woman" speech, because we found out that that wasn't even written by the person that they're claiming it was written by. It was actually written by a white woman. um, and we lamented that we could not use that speech because even though it would be, perfect to be able to say, hey, oftentimes certain bodies, especially bodies that are clearly, people who identify as women, especially Black women or Black and brown women, are not seen as women. Um, we could not use that because of the falsehood behind that actual writing. So even within that very movement, a lot of there were a lot of myths that are still being addressed until today. Many people did not know that that was not written um, by Sojourner Truth. Next slide, please. So it's important as we continue to move forward to explore how surveillance impacts marginalized communities. And surveillance practices often have a disproportionate impact on the communities that we work in, and further widen existing inequalities. Discrimination, racial profiling, gender profiling, um, gender identity, and socioeconomic status can result from surveillance and continue to perpetuate social injustices, right? And also surveillance can reinforce power imbalances, allowing these folks who are in power to position themselves in a way that they misuse their power or abuse surveillance technologies for control and oppression. And I'll turn it to Alicia. Next slide, please.
Thank you. I'll probably move through this one. I'm like really mindful of time, so I
Yeah,
will
yeah,
I'll move through this one pretty quickly. But just want to like reiterate what Lucane has said, which is that social norms often place restrictions on individuals' choices and expression that limit bodily autonomy, including cultural biases and stereotypes that impose unrealistic beauty standards, rigid gender roles, and constraining sexual norms. And then, of course, like we've mentioned, systemic barriers like inadequate healthcare, limited access to education, and economic disparities can further impede marginalized communities from further exercising our own bodily autonomy. Next slide, please. And Lucane, I can just keep going if that's okay. Um, I want to talk just a little bit because I feel like this sounds really dire. And there's actually some really powerful organizing, advocacy, legislative advocacy that's happening. So let's talk about some of the strategies that folks are using to collaborate with marginalized communities in reclaiming our bodily autonomy. So, of course, there is, just like we're doing for many other issue areas, we're engaged in political and social education and awareness about bodily autonomy, that which equips individuals with the knowledge and tools to make informed choices and challenge existing norms. Engaging in advocacy and activism initiates and amplifies the importance of bodily autonomy and drives systemic changes to protect individual and communal rights. And then support networks. So building and strengthening support networks within marginalized communities provides individuals with the necessary resources, information, and solidarity that they need to reclaim and protect their bodily autonomy. Fun fact, about 10 years ago, Lucane and I, was that 10 years ago, Lucane? Started our own body positive support group. And we were like, well, we
Yes.
feel like we really need this, but like, will people show up? And it was the most incredible experience of having like somewhere between like 10 to 15 people for this multi-week session, training and like peer support group of fat folks who wanted to like explore bodily autonomy and bodily sovereignty of mostly Black and brown, trans and queer people. So I don't know, I'm like, we didn't like try, it wasn't on purpose, but like here we were, almost all
Yeah.
survivors, all Black and brown, all trans and queer and gender nonconforming, exploring our relationships to bodily autonomy together because those things are so deeply interwoven. So that's one way that support networks can really show up. I'll talk a little bit about, am I on slide 24, the legal and policy considerations?
I think that's the next slide.
Okay, perfect. Yes, that's right.
Yes,
Thank you so
hold on.
much. So let's consider some of the legal and policy aspects of bodily autonomy. One thing that we was in the slide, but I don't know if we actually lifted out, was the Crown Act. So I just want to like uplift some of the work so the Crown Act is a piece of legislation specifically centered on supporting Black women to be able to wear the hairstyles that, first of all, the hair that grows out of our head, and then secondly, the hairstyles that are like culturally relevant and appropriate to us. What we know is that Black women are more hairstyles are more surveilled, and we've seen us not being hired or being told that our natural hair and curly hair is unprofessional, right? So the Crown Act, I mean, the discrimination was obviously so real that we had to create a whole piece of legislation around it, right? So we're not being hyperbolic about this, right? Like the hair that I have right now is seen as unprofessional, right? Or me wearing my hair in a head wrap that is culturally relevant to my community is seen as somehow unprofessional, right? So there are actual policy implications and pieces of legislation that are moving that are protecting our bodily autonomy. So rights protection, so legal frameworks, there are legal frameworks and policies that really must prioritize the protection of individual rights, including bodily autonomy, and also establish mechanisms for remedying violations. Enacting legislation that explicitly guarantees bodily autonomy and addresses discrimination and surveillance is really essential in safeguarding the rights of marginalized communities. So it's crucial as we're thinking about pieces of legislation that support Black women, Black gender marginalized folks, of course, including Black trans women. It's crucial to really adopt and particularly Black fat folks to adopt an intersectional approach, taking into account the diverse experiences and challenges that are faced by different marginalized communities so that we can ensure really effective policies that are like supporting all of our needs. I'm going to skip some of the technology stuff, but I encourage you to read it. So I might ask uh, for us to move to the slide that is about success stories. So that's a couple slides away. Thank you. Thank you so much. Keep going.
Yeah,
You got this. Keep going. There we go. That's
yeah,
right.
that's it.
Yeah. So, because I am mindful of time and I want to make sure that we have time for questions. One thing that I will say about technology is some of the ways that we've seen technology showing up is like, oh my goodness, AI, right? We are seeing AI. What we know though is that AI is being like used in really profound ways right now, both to create ease and access, but also to surveil communities, right? Stop doing those put your face on something because, who knows who's going to use it 10 years from now, right? But we're seeing AI be really used. But what we also know about AI is that it is based on who has created it. And so often Black women in particular and Black trans folks are not included in our vision of what AI looks like, right? So if you've ever tried to use one of those face filters or, face AI generators, right? They often don't kind of replicate blackface as well, right? Because it is biased by the folks who are actually creating the AI. And then the other thing I'll share is like other forms of facial recognition that we may be using that can also be used to surveil. And then my final example is that there was a study done about the hand washing, the automatic hand washing, where you stick your hand under there to turn the water on in public restrooms, and how Black folks were thinking that none of the sinks worked. And what it turns out is that they didn't actually pick up on darker colored hands and skin, right? So so much of our technology is actually biased and anti-Black. Let me talk about some success stories, right? So there are so many ways that folks, individuals, and communities are reclaiming our bodily autonomy through acts of resistance, advocacy, and support. Some of these stories showcase the power of collective action and resiliency of marginalized communities. We know that grassroots organizations and community-led initiatives are instrumental in creating spaces for education, fostering support networks, and facilitating collective action. This all plays a crucial role in empowering individuals and communities to reclaim their bodily autonomy. I hope that, let's move on to the next slide because I've got some conclusions here, but I want to make space for y'all if you are also coming to some of your own conclusions. I have some curiosities for you. But really, we just want to share that reclaiming bodily autonomy is a vital endeavor. It's a vital and survivor-centered endeavor that requires collective action and awareness. Some key takeaways that we really want to leave you with is that understanding the intersectionality of identities and the unique challenges that are faced by different communities is really imperative to the work that we are doing to interrupt patriarchal violence. Community initiatives and grassroots organizations play a crucial role in supporting, advocating for, and educating individuals and communities in reclaiming autonomy. I think one of the other big takeaways for me is that this is a holistic, we're talking a history and present and future. This is really a holistic experience of what we're talking about when we mean bodily autonomy. It's our collective responsibility then to challenge oppressive systems, to advocate for policies that protect bodily autonomy and sovereignty, and to create inclusive spaces that respect and support diverse bodies and diverse identities. And by working together, we can really dismantle the harmful norms and promote empowerment and ensure that everyone has the right tools to make decisions about our own bodies. So I'll stop there and we can maybe stop sharing for now, and just want to turn it to folks in the chat to see if folks have questions or things that are coming up or how this is resonating for y'all. Any thoughts that folks want to share in the chat? Lucane, maybe I'll turn it to you to have the final word as well.
Yeah, sure. Thank God it got quiet in here. I just want to share a quick story. My daughter is 9, but she is and she's very tall. People usually don't think she's 9. And lately she has been policed, heavily policed in her school. Like every time I send her to school, she comes back home crying or just nervous about what she wore. I've gotten notes from the teacher telling me, like, oh, maybe, she's growing. I noticed she's growing faster than the rest of the kids. And maybe you should put some shorts under her clothes. Let me tell y'all, one time she came home with shorts that I didn't send her to school with. One of the teachers gave her clothes to wear. So, of course, I wrote her a whole letter about policing my daughter's bodies and how that really impacted her. And we've taught her to say, stop policing my body. stop. And she's very proud to say that. And I said, it's okay. You don't have to be rude, but you can tell your teacher, look, stop policing my body. And I talked to her about that. You know, when you police children's bodies, you don't allow them to be free. What happens is that they start to really question themselves, question their bodies, question their worth. You know, she really came home crying and was just so worried about her body when she's 9. And I think sexualizing her and making her feel like it's her fault that she's getting this attention at 9 is not okay. It's not okay at any age, but I just wanted to end with that story to say, like, the surveillance happens everywhere, right? But it starts happening at such an early age, and it's up to us to really help advocate or help, I don't want to say empower, but collaborate with children to help them understand that they have the right to say, you know, stop policing my body. I don't, you know, I don't like that. And that there are a lot of connections to sexual violence, sexual
Yes,
exploitation,
right.
and domestic violence. All of it is connected. So
Hmm.
that's my last piece of comment.
That's a really powerful last piece of comment, Lucane. And thank you for sharing that story and also like
Yeah.
giving us some practical tools about the way you're supporting her and learning how to advocate for herself. Because what I think, Lucane, you and I have both found is that often the first people who are body shaming us and policing our bodies are our own families, right? And so
Yes, yes.
what a powerful space to be in, to be affirmed within your own family, really
Yeah.
giving you the tools and like confidence needed to go out into the world and advocate for yourself too. So I really encourage folks who are here with us today, like to think about what are the ways that you are harboring your own like body shame and policing, and how
Yeah.
that's showing up in the way that you're interacting with young folks in your life, with survivors in your life, and how you can start to really dismantle and chip away at some of those narratives that we've all been socialized to believe, right? So
Yes.
it's not that we're
Yes.
wrong, right? Because we've been
Mhm.
socialized to believe these things about ourselves and our communities, and how can we chip away at that? So thank you, yeah, thank you so much for sharing that story.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
we want free Black children, so that's
Right.
goal. So thank you, Devanya, for, and so excited to know that you'll be sharing this information with your teen daughter. That's so powerful. That gives me goosebumps. Um, thank you, Salamawit. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Salam. Hi, Salam. It's so good to see you.
Thank you,
Hello.
Lynn. Yeah, thank you. Thank y'all so much for being here with us. And thank y'all for letting us have this conversation with you. Lucane and I have been thinking about this for a really long time, and it's been really exciting, I think, to get to like write some of this praxis down and
Yes.
really start to like flush it out. So maybe we were a little ambitious with the amount of slides we had, but really excited to share this space with you. Araba, should I turn it back to you to like have the final word and close us out?
Oh, we just want to say thank you both so very much. As you can tell in the chat, everyone is affirming this presentation was super informative, super educational. Like, I think I've learned a lot of things that I didn't know before. So I know there was many amazing, great takeaways. So thank you both. If anyone had any closing final thoughts or questions, you can also feel free to come off of mute and either ask a question or just affirm Lucane and Alicia. But this was overall a great presentation. So I'll just give everyone like a minute or so to do so.
Yeah, and we can put out emails too in the chat.
Yes. Please do share
People,
your contact so that, you know.
I think it's on the last slide, the last page of the slide. I don't know if you got a chance to add that, Alicia. Oh, okay. I'll just put mine. You
It's
put
not
yours
there.
and I'll
I'm
do
sorry,
mine.
y'all. We'll put it in the chat box.
Um,
All right.
sorry.
Oh,
All right.
no worries. Well, if there are no closing thoughts or questions, once again, thank you so much. Please do stay tuned for our last and final workshop this afternoon at 3. We cannot wait to see each and every one of you.